But when people try to argue that Caitlin Clark is not the face of the league, or that the WNBA would be exactly where it is today without her, you're literally dumb as hell. Jealousy toward Caitlin Clark has become a major topic of conversation. Sophie Cunningham has been openly criticizing people who refuse to acknowledge that Caitlin Clark is the face of the WNBA. Cunningham has finally decided to say what she really thinks, and she is not holding back. She is calling out the old guard. She is calling out the people who continue to refuse to admit that Caitlin Clark is the face of the league. Finally, someone understands it. Finally, someone in the WNBA understands something extremely important about business. And Sophie Cunningham may have just made herself even more unpopular with the people who already didn't like her. Welcome back. Today's WNBA story is heating up as Sophie Cunningham and Lexie Hull reportedly speak out about Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark's MVP run. Is Caitlin Clark being held back, or is there something bigger happening behind the scenes? We're going to break down the latest reactions, the controversy, and everything surrounding Caitlin Clark. So let's get right into it. Take a moment and imagine this. You own a basketball team. Finally, you have the most popular player in the entire sport. Your arenas are completely sold out. Television viewership has tripled. Sponsorship opportunities are increasing. Then, only a few months after a brutal playoff series where the coach of another team watched as her players physically assaulted, bruised, and left your young star bleeding, you turn around and hire that exact same coach to lead your team. At that point, the question isn't hypothetical. The Indiana Fever actually did it. The floodgates opened when one of the league's most outspoken players, Sophie Cunningham, finally spoke about the situation on a podcast and said what many fans had already been shouting at their television screens. Today, we're going through this entire story step by step. If you appreciate this content, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Believe it or not, more than 73% of viewers haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free and only takes a second, but your support means a lot. So, have you subscribed already? Great. Thank you for the support. Now let's get back to the story. By the end of this video, you'll have a much clearer understanding of why so many passionate basketball fans believe there is a serious problem within the WNBA. Before we get into the controversy, we need to establish the bigger picture. You have to understand what Caitlin Clark represents to this league before you can understand why so many fans became upset. The Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark out of the University of Iowa with the first overall pick in the WNBA draft back in April of 2024. And this was not an ordinary draft selection. During her final 2 seasons of college basketball, Clark had broken record after record. By the time her college career ended, she had become the highest scorer in NCAA Division I basketball history, for both men and women. Think about that for a moment. More points than Pete Maravich. More points than Kelsey Plum. More points than anyone who had ever scored at the collegiate level. But Clark wasn't simply breaking scoring records. She introduced a style of basketball that women's basketball had never seen at that volume. She was taking three-point shots from far beyond the line. She was making defenders look completely unprepared with no-look passes. Her pace and attitude sometimes looked more like watching Steph Curry than watching a traditional point guard. And because of that, she didn't just bring her basketball skills with her. She brought the audience with her. Her college games shattered previous television ratings records. More people watched her final game at Iowa than the men's championship that same year. The average attendance for the women's championship game was 18.9 million. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So when Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA in May 2024, the Indiana Fever were suddenly more than just another basketball team. Almost immediately, they became one of the most watched products in women's professional sports. Given permission to use charter flights. And according to many athletes, one player was a major reason behind that change. Caitlin Clark. But this is where the story takes its first uncomfortable turn. Because that level of attention did not sit well with everyone around the league. Not even close. From the very first preseason game, it became obvious that Caitlin Clark was not going to be welcomed with open arms by everyone. Veterans around the league had a phrase for it. They called it paying your dues. And night after night, fans could see what that appeared to mean. Only a few weeks into her rookie campaign, in June 2024, Jendi Carter of the Chicago Sky shoulder-checked Clark to the ground during a deadball situation. In other words, the play had already stopped. The whistle had already been blown. And Clark was sent into the air. Initially, the league classified the incident as a common foul. But after massive public criticism and viral slow-motion footage, the foul was upgraded to a flagrant one. The message, however, had already been delivered. This was a rookie entering a league where physical play was going to be part of her experience. Later that summer, Chicago Sky player Diamond DeShields delivered another body check that sent Clark to the floor. Once again, the contact happened away from the ball. And once again, the incident was later upgraded to a flagrant foul. Same pattern. Different night. Different opponent. Then came June 17, 2025. And things became even more intense during a game against the Connecticut Sun. JCS Sheldon, a Sun guard, jabbed Clark in the eye. Clark was also pushed to the ground by Sun guard Massey Hines-Allen. The Fever bench erupted as teammates and players reacted to what had happened. Sophie Cunningham, who had been traded to the Fever during the offseason, left her feet, rushed in, and physically intervened. The footage of Cunningham standing up for Clark quickly went viral. And her jersey sales reportedly skyrocketed overnight. Fans had been waiting for someone to speak up. Finally, someone did. But even those incidents involving Carter, DeShields, Sheldon, and Hines-Allen do not compare with what happened during the 2024 postseason. Because that is where this story really begins to take off. Before we get there, there is something many older basketball fans noticed that the national media largely ignored. Caitlin Clark led the WNBA in flagrant fouls received during her debut season in 2024. It's worth repeating. During her rookie season, the first overall pick received more flagrant fouls than any other player in the WNBA. That is not exactly normal. Most rookies, no matter how much attention they receive, do not experience that kind of physical treatment. You can debate what caused it. You can argue that it was simply her playing style. You can say it was coincidence. You can believe there was something more intentional behind it. People will always disagree about those explanations. But the number itself is a fact recorded in the statistics. And that number became one of the reasons fans began questioning how the league was handling its most valuable young star. The way other players talked about Clark became another important part of the story. Some players made it clear that they were unhappy with the amount of attention she was receiving. The phrase special whistle was used by rookie Angel Reese to describe what she believed was preferential officiating toward Clark. Several veterans also talked about Clark needing to learn the league, earn her place, and be humbled. You can explain some of that as normal rookie versus veteran dynamics. Every professional sports league has that. But the difference here was the intensity. The volume. And the way the entire situation spread across social media. Sophie Cunningham would later suggest that the issue went beyond basketball itself. And that brings us to September 22, 2024. The Mohegan Sun Arena in Uncasville, Connecticut. Game 1 of the WNBA playoffs. The Indiana Fever were facing the Connecticut Sun in their first postseason appearance since 2016. And on the opposite sideline was Connecticut Sun head coach Stephanie White. Remember that name. Stephanie White becomes one of the central figures in this story. Less than 2 minutes into the first quarter, Caitlin Clark made a simple pass to her teammate Aaliyah Boston. As the pass was being made, Sun guard Dejonae Carrington moved in to defend the play. Her fingernail, which was reportedly long and acrylic, made contact with Clark's right eye as her hand came down. Clark immediately grabbed her face and fell to the floor. No foul was called. The game continued. Now, to be fair, we need to acknowledge what both players said afterward. Dejonae Carrington and Caitlin Clark publicly stated that they did not believe the contact was intentional. When Clark was asked about the incident afterward, she essentially dismissed the idea that Carrington intentionally tried to hurt her. She said the contact was not intentional. And that is important because we should separate what is known from what is speculation. The contact happened. Clark's eye was hit. She left the game with a noticeable black eye. And she finished the game shooting 4 of 17 from the field during a 24-point loss for Indiana. Whether the contact was intentional or accidental, the physical consequences were real. And that image of the league's #1 overall pick lying on the floor and holding her face became one of the most recognizable images from that WNBA season. The Connecticut Sun won the first game. Then they won the second. In just 2 games, the Sun swept the Fever out of the playoffs. And on the other side of the court was Stephanie White, whose Connecticut team had just eliminated Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever. If you're an Indiana Fever fan, you remember that series. You remember the eye contact. You remember the hard fouls. You remember the bruises. You remember the trash talk. And you remember the feeling that your young star had just been put through an extremely physical playoff series. Then the offseason arrived. And fans naturally expected the Fever to make changes. The thinking was simple. The team had its franchise player. The team had its young star. Now they needed a coach who could protect that player, develop the roster, and take Indiana to another level. On October 27, 2024, the Indiana Fever announced that head coach Christy Sides had been fired. Sides had completed seasons with records of 20-20. She had taken a team that had finished near the bottom and helped lead them to the playoffs. By many standards, she had done her job. But the Fever wanted more. They wanted a coach capable of turning a generational talent into a championship-level player. So who did they choose? On November 1st, just a few days later, the Fever officially announced their new head coach. Stephanie White. Yes. Stephanie White. Only about 6 weeks earlier, White had stood on the opposite sideline while her Connecticut team eliminated Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever from the playoffs, with Clark leaving the series with a black eye. And now she was going to coach Clark. It's easy to understand why fans were confused. Social media exploded. Hashtags began trending. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. To many fans, the front office had chosen the same coach whose team had just physically punished their young star to lead that same player into her second WNBA season. But to be fair, there is another side to the story. Stephanie White was not some random coaching hire. Her resume is extremely difficult to argue against. She is a highly respected basketball mind. She was a high school basketball legend at Seeker High School in West Lebanon, Indiana. She was born and raised in Indiana. In 1999, she helped lead Purdue University to a national championship, which remains the only Big Ten Conference women's basketball championship. After that, she spent 4 of her 5 WNBA seasons with the Indiana Fever. In 2011, she returned to Indianapolis as an assistant coach. In 2012, she was part of the staff when the Fever won the franchise's only championship. She later became the Fever's head coach in 2015 and 2016. After leaving Indiana to coach Vanderbilt, she returned to the WNBA with the Connecticut Sun. At Vanderbilt, she finished with a combined record of 55-25 over 2 seasons. In both seasons, her teams reached the semifinals. In 2023, she was named Coach of the Year. So objectively speaking, Stephanie White is one of the most accomplished basketball minds in women's basketball. From the front office's perspective, this wasn't necessarily about betrayal. It was about bringing a successful coach back home. The legendary Indiana basketball figure was returning to guide the team she had already helped build. That was the official version of the story. But there was a problem. Press releases aren't what fans remember. Fans remember moments. Indiana Fever fans remembered seeing their 22-year-old superstar on the floor, holding her face. And when the announcement was made, the reaction in the comment sections was anything but friendly. That is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because eventually, someone inside the league started speaking openly. That person was Sophie Cunningham. Sophie Cunningham had already made it clear that she was not afraid to speak her mind. And when she began talking about Caitlin Clark, conversation became much bigger than one player or one team. Cunningham understood something that many people inside professional sports understand very well. Popularity matters. Attention matters. And when an athlete brings millions of new eyes to a league, that athlete becomes extremely important to the business side of the sport. According to Cunningham's perspective, pretending otherwise makes no sense. You can dislike Caitlin Clark. You can disagree with her fans. You can criticize her game. You can argue about whether she deserves every award or every headline. But denying the impact she has had on the WNBA is a completely different argument. And that is exactly where Cunningham appeared to draw the line. The conversation became especially interesting because Cunningham was not simply defending Clark as a teammate. She was talking about the bigger picture. The WNBA needed to recognize what was happening. The league had suddenly found a player who could bring casual sports fans into women's basketball. People who had never watched a WNBA game were now watching. People who didn't know the teams were learning the rosters. People who had never purchased a WNBA ticket were suddenly looking for tickets. And people who previously had no reason to follow the league were now checking social media every night to see what Caitlin Clark had done. That type of attention is extremely difficult to manufacture. You cannot simply buy it. You cannot create it with a marketing campaign. It happens when a player connects with an audience. Caitlin Clark had that connection. And the Fever were benefiting from it. But this is also where the debate surrounding Stephanie White became complicated. Because if White was responsible for coaching the team, developing Clark, and helping Indiana become a championship contender, then hiring her could make perfect basketball sense. But if fans believed White's previous team had been too physical with Clark, then the emotional reaction was going to be completely different. And that's what happened. Fans were divided. Some supporters said the Fever had made an excellent basketball decision. Others asked a much simpler question. Why would you put the coach who had just eliminated Caitlin Clark in charge of protecting and developing her? That question continued to spread. And then another voice entered the conversation. Lexie Hull. Hull had already spent time around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever organization. She understood what the team looked like before Clark arrived. She also understood how dramatically the atmosphere had changed after Clark became part of the roster. The attention was different. The expectations were different. The pressure was different. Everything was different. And that matters because the Fever weren't simply trying to build a normal young roster anymore. They were building around one of the biggest young stars in professional basketball. That means every coaching decision becomes more important. Every roster decision receives more attention. Every injury becomes a major headline. Every loss gets analyzed. Every controversial play becomes a national discussion. And every victory can become a viral moment. That is the reality of having Caitlin Clark on your team. The spotlight is enormous. But so is the opportunity. And that brings us back to the question at the center of this entire controversy. Was Stephanie White actually the wrong choice? Or was the Fever organization simply choosing the best basketball coach available? Those are two very different questions. If you look at White's coaching resume, the answer appears obvious. She has experience. She knows Indiana. She knows the organization. She understands the WNBA. She has coached at a championship level. And she has already proven that she can develop players. From that perspective, the Fever's decision makes sense. But sports are not played inside spreadsheets. They're played in front of people. And fans have memories. They remember what happened. They remember the moments that made them angry. They remember the moments that made them celebrate. And when the same coach associated with one of those controversial moments suddenly becomes the coach of their favorite player, emotions are going to take over. That is exactly why the hiring became such a major talking point. But here's the bigger question. What would happen next? Would White actually protect Clark? Would she change the way the Fever played? Would she create an offensive system designed specifically around Clark's strengths? Would she help Clark take another step forward? Or would the Fever simply become another team struggling to figure out how to maximize a generational talent? Those questions were impossible to answer immediately. A coaching hire does not prove anything by itself. The results have to come on the court. And that is where White would eventually be judged. Not by the press conference. Not by social media. Not by the opinions of fans. By wins. By development. By performance. And ultimately, by whether the Indiana Fever could become a legitimate championship contender. But before that could happen, another issue had already become impossible to ignore. The Caitlin Clark effect was changing the economics of the WNBA. And the numbers surrounding her popularity were becoming too large for anyone to dismiss. Everywhere Clark went, attention followed. Home games. Road games. National television. Local television. Social media. Merchandise. Ticket demand. Her presence changed the conversation around the sport. And that created a strange situation. The league had spent years trying to grow. Then one player suddenly accelerated that growth. That should have been an easy victory for everyone. But instead, it created tension. Critics argued that the WNBA was bigger than one player. Both sides had arguments. But there was one thing that neither side could realistically deny. Caitlin Clark had changed the level of attention surrounding the league. And Sophie Cunningham was willing to say that out loud. That made her comments even more significant. Because when someone inside the league says something that many fans already believe, conversation becomes much harder to ignore. Suddenly, this was no longer just fans arguing on social media. It was players discussing the same issue. And that is where the story gets much deeper. Because if Caitlin Clark really is the face of the WNBA, what responsibility does the league have toward her? Does being the biggest star mean she should receive special treatment? Absolutely not. A superstar should still follow the rules. She should still be officiated fairly. She should still be criticized when she plays badly. She should still have to compete. But there is another responsibility. The league has to make sure its biggest stars are able to compete without unnecessary physical danger. That applies to Clark. And it applies to every other player. This isn't about creating special rules for one athlete. It's about enforcing the existing rules consistently. And that's where many fans believe the WNBA has struggled. When a physical play happens, fans want to know that the same standard will be applied regardless of which player is involved. If a foul is dangerous, punish it. If it's legal contact, let the players compete. But don't allow the rules to become dependent on popularity. That is the balance every professional league has to find. And Caitlin Clark's popularity makes the balance even more difficult. Because every controversial call is immediately magnified. Every replay is analyzed. Every referee decision is debated. And every opponent who makes hard contact with Clark can instantly become the subject of millions of social media posts. That is the price of becoming a superstar. But it is also the opportunity. Because superstars create stories. And stories create audiences. And audiences create business. That is why the Caitlin Clark conversation is much bigger than basketball. It is about the future of the WNBA. It is about how the league handles its biggest stars. It is about how teams build around generational players. And it is about whether the league can turn this incredible wave of attention into long-term growth. The Indiana Fever are now directly in the middle of that experiment. They have Caitlin Clark. They have an increasingly passionate fan base. They have a coach with championship experience. And they have enormous expectations. Now they have to deliver. Because once a team becomes this popular, excuses become harder to accept. Fans don't simply want highlights. They want progress. They want meaningful playoff runs. They want championships. And most importantly, they want to see Caitlin Clark reach the level that so many people believe she can reach. That's why the Stephanie White decision matters. It isn't simply about one coaching hire. It is about what the Fever believe Caitlin Clark can become. and what they believe this franchise can become with her. If White succeeds, the decision will eventually look brilliant. If the team struggles, fans will revisit every criticism that came immediately after the announcement. That's how sports work. Winning changes the narrative. Losing changes it again. And for Caitlin Clark, the pressure is only getting bigger. Because now she isn't simply trying to become a great WNBA player. She is trying to become one of the defining athletes of her generation. And that journey is only beginning. But there is another reason this entire situation became so emotionally charged. Caitlin Clark is not entering a normal stage of her career anymore. The expectations surrounding her are enormous. Every season, fans expect improvement. Every game, they expect big numbers. Every major matchup becomes an event. And every decision made by the Indiana Fever is examined through one question. Does this help Caitlin Clark become the best player she can possibly be? That is a tremendous amount of pressure for any athlete. But Clark has already shown that she understands pressure. She dealt with it at Iowa. She dealt with it when she became the first overall pick. She dealt with it when she entered the WNBA. And she dealt with it when every opponent knew that stopping her was one of the most important parts of beating Indiana. The difference now is that she has a professional organization built around her. And that organization has to make the right decisions. The coaching staff has to understand her strength. The front office has to surround her with the right players. The team has to create an offensive system that allows her to use her shooting, passing, movement, and court vision. And perhaps most importantly, the Fever need to make sure Clark doesn't have to carry the entire organization by herself. That is where Stephanie White's experience could become extremely important. White has already coached at the highest levels. She understands how to prepare a team. She understands defensive adjustments. She understands offensive systems. And she knows what it takes to compete for championships. But coaching Caitlin Clark is going to be different from coaching almost anyone else. Because Clark changes the way defenses prepare. When she steps across half court, defenders have to think about her shooting range. When she moves without the ball, defenders have to stay connected. When she gets the ball in transition, defenders have to react immediately. And when defenses focus too heavily on her, she can create opportunities for teammates. That means the Fever cannot simply build an ordinary offense. They need an offense that takes advantage of what makes Clark special. This is where White's basketball knowledge will be tested. Can she create enough space for Clark? Can she keep the offense unpredictable? Can she develop the other players around her? Can she make opponents pay when they send extra defenders toward Clark? Those questions will ultimately determine whether the coaching hire was successful. But there is another issue. Caitlin Clark's popularity means the Fever have something most teams would love to have. They have a player who can attract attention even when the team is struggling. That's extremely valuable. But it can also create problems. When a team becomes dependent on one player for attention, everyone else has to work harder to develop. The Fever cannot simply rely on Clark to solve every problem. They need a complete roster. They need players who can defend. They need players who can shoot. They need players who can rebound. They need players who can create their own offense. And they need players who understand how to play alongside a superstar. That is how championship teams are built. Michael Jordan didn't win championships alone. LeBron James didn't win championships alone. Stephen Curry didn't win championships alone. Every superstar eventually needs teammates capable of performing when the pressure increases. And that may be the next major challenge for Indiana. Because the excitement around Caitlin Clark is already enormous. Now the basketball results have to catch up with the attention. This is where the conversation about the WNBA becomes much bigger. For years, the league has wanted more national attention. It wanted more television coverage. It wanted larger crowds. It wanted more sponsorships. It wanted young fans to grow up watching women's basketball. Now that attention is arriving. But attention alone isn't enough. The league needs to keep those fans. That means creating competitive games. That means protecting the integrity of the competition. That means developing stars. And it means giving fans reasons to come back. Caitlin Clark is one of those reasons. Angel Reese is another. Aya Wilson is another. Sabrina Ionescu is another. And that is actually good news. Because a healthy league cannot depend on one person forever. It needs multiple stars. Multiple rivalries. Multiple storylines. Multiple teams that fans genuinely care about. That's what makes professional sports sustainable. And this is why the relationship between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese continues to attract so much attention. Their rivalry has begun at the same time. That's what sports fans have always loved. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird didn't need to hate each other for their rivalry to become legendary. Michael Jordan had rivals. LeBron James had rivals. Kobe Bryant had rivals. Stephen Curry had rivals. Those rivalries created stories. Those stories created fans. And those fans helped grow the sport. Clark and Reese could potentially become part of that tradition. But their careers are still young. Nobody knows exactly where either player will eventually end up. And that's what makes watching their careers so interesting. At the same time, Caitlin Clark's situation has created another debate. Should the WNBA market her more aggressively? Some fans believe the answer is obvious. If one player is bringing huge numbers of new viewers into the league, why wouldn't the league maximize that opportunity? Others believe the WNBA needs to remain bigger than any individual player. Again, both sides have an argument. The best solution may actually be somewhere in the middle. Promote Caitlin Clark. Promote Angel Reese. Promote Aya Wilson. Promote Sabrina Ionescu. Promote the entire league. Give fans more reasons to care about more players. That way, Caitlin Clark's popularity doesn't become a weakness. It becomes an entry point. Someone watches Clark. Then they discover Reese. Then they discover Wilson. Then they discover another team. Then they start watching playoff games. Eventually, they become WNBA fans. That is how growth works. And that is why the Fever's decisions matter beyond Indiana. What happens with Caitlin Clark can influence the entire league. If she becomes an even bigger star, the league benefits. If Indiana becomes a championship contender, the league benefits. If more fans begin watching because of her, the league benefits. And if Clark develops into a player capable of dominating at the highest level, women's basketball benefits. That's the opportunity. But opportunities come with risks. The larger the spotlight becomes, the more criticism follows. Every missed shot becomes a headline. Every turnover becomes a debate. Every hard foul becomes a controversy. Every coaching decision becomes a social media argument. That's the reality of modern sports. And Clark has already experienced it. But perhaps the most important thing is how she responds. Great athletes eventually learn how to turn pressure into motivation. They learn how to ignore distractions. They learn how to focus on improvement. And they learn that they cannot control everything people say about them. Clark will have to do the same. Because the next stage of her career is going to be even more demanding. The league knows what she can do. Opponents know what she can do. Fans know what she can do. Now the challenge is taking that talent to another level. And that brings us back to Stephanie White. White has been given a huge responsibility. She has to coach one of the most talked about players in the world. She has to manage an extremely demanding fan base. She has to develop a young roster. She has to compete against some of the best teams in the WNBA. And she has to prove that the Fever made the correct decision. If she succeeds, the criticism will disappear. That's usually how sports works. Nobody remembers the controversy when the championship arrives. Nobody remembers the doubts when the team starts winning. But if things go wrong, every old question returns. Why did Indiana hire White? Why didn't they choose someone else? Did they make the right decision? Was the organization prepared? Those questions will eventually be answered on the court. Not by social media. Not by podcasts. Not by rumors. By basketball. And that's why the next season could be one of the most important periods in the history of the Indiana Fever. The organization has a superstar. It has attention. It has a growing fan base. And now it has a coach with a major resume. The pieces are there. The challenge is putting everything together. Because Caitlin Clark's career is moving into a new phase. The rookie chapter is over. The surprise factor is gone. Opponents know what she can do. Now they have to find a way to stop her. And Clark has to find a way to become even better. That is what separates good players from great players. The ability to adjust. The ability to respond. The ability to improve after everyone else has figured out your game. And if Caitlin Clark can do that, the possibilities are enormous. Maybe she becomes an MVP. Maybe she becomes a champion. Maybe she becomes one of the greatest players in WNBA history. Nobody can know that yet. But the opportunity is clearly there. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from this entire controversy. The story isn't really about one coach. It isn't really about one controversial playoff series. And it isn't really about one viral moment. It's about what happens when a generational talent enters a league that is still trying to figure out how to handle unprecedented attention. The WNBA has been given an extraordinary opportunity. Caitlin Clark has brought millions of eyes to the sport. Now the league has to decide what it does with those eyes. Does it turn them into long-term fans? Does it continue developing its stars? Does it create a better environment for its players? Does it improve the product? And can it turn this moment into something that lasts for decades? Those are the questions that matter. Because Caitlin Clark won't be a rookie forever. The attention surrounding her will eventually become normal. Another generation of players will arrive. Another group of stars will emerge. And when that happens, people may look back at this period and say that this was the moment everything changed. The moment women's basketball became impossible to ignore. The moment players became bigger brands. The moment rivalries became national conversations. And the moment the WNBA entered an entirely different era. Caitlin Clark is at the center of that transformation. Stephanie White is now responsible for helping guide her through the next chapter. And Indiana Fever fans are waiting to see what happens next. Because after all the controversy, all the arguments, and all the questions, there is only one thing that can ultimately settle the debate. The basketball court. And this is where the story reaches its most important point. Because once you remove all the social media arguments, all the emotional reactions, and all the online speculation, one question remains. What does the Indiana Fever organization actually want to build around Caitlin Clark? That question is much bigger than one season. It is bigger than one coach. And it is certainly bigger than one controversial playoff series. The Fever now have an opportunity that very few franchises ever receive. They have a young superstar who already has enormous national attention. They have a fan base that has expanded dramatically. They have people watching games who previously had little or no connection to the WNBA. And they have a player whose career is still in its early stages. That combination is extremely valuable. But it also creates enormous responsibility. Because when you have a player this important, every decision becomes part of the story. The front office can't simply make decisions in isolation anymore. Fans are going to analyze everything. The coaching staff will be analyzed. The roster will be analyzed. The offensive system will be analyzed. Even individual substitutions will be analyzed. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. High expectations are part of becoming a major sports franchise. The real challenge is turning those expectations into results. That's where Stephanie White now enters the picture. White knows Indiana. She knows the organization. She knows the league. And she has already experienced the pressure that comes with coaching at the highest level. But now the pressure is different. She isn't simply coaching another WNBA roster. She is coaching Caitlin Clark. That means the margin for error becomes much smaller. If Clark struggles, people will immediately ask whether the system is working. If the Fever lose, people will ask whether the roster is good enough. If Clark has a great game but the team loses, people will ask whether the supporting cast is doing enough. And if the Fever win, everyone will want to know whether this is finally the beginning of something special. That's the reality of coaching a superstar. Everything becomes magnified. But White also has an opportunity. She can take what she knows about Clark's game and build an offensive system that makes her even more dangerous. Clark doesn't need to become a completely different player. She needs the freedom to become an even better version of herself. Her shooting creates spacing. Her passing creates opportunities. Her ability to push the ball creates transition chances. Her movement forces defenders to make difficult decisions. And when defenders overcommit, Clark can punish them with passes. That's the foundation of an elite offensive player. The challenge is surrounding that skill set with teammates who can maximize it. The Fever need players who can consistently knock down open shots. They need players who can finish around the basket. They need players who can defend at a high level. And they need players who can take pressure off Clark when defenses become aggressive. Because eventually, every opponent is going to understand the same thing. If you can make Caitlin Clark uncomfortable, you give yourself a better chance to beat Indiana. That means the Fever have to make sure opponents cannot simply focus on Clark for an entire game. This is where roster construction becomes critical. A superstar can raise the ceiling of a team. But a deep roster determines how high that ceiling actually goes. And that's something every great franchise eventually learns. You can have the best player in the world and still lose if the roster around that player isn't strong enough. Michael Jordan needed Scottie Pippen. LeBron James needed elite teammates. Stephen Curry needed a complete Warriors roster. Even the greatest players in basketball history needed support. Caitlin Clark will be no different. And that doesn't diminish her greatness. It actually shows why building the right team around her is so important. Because if Indiana can create that supporting structure, Clark's impact could become enormous. Not just statistically. Commercially. Culturally. And historically. That is why so many people are watching this team. The Fever are no longer just another WNBA franchise. They have become one of the league's biggest attractions. And Caitlin Clark is the biggest reason why. But there is another important part of this conversation. The league itself has to evolve. WNBA is entering a period where more players are becoming recognizable outside of basketball. That is a major shift. In previous generations, many women's basketball players were known primarily by dedicated basketball fans. Today, players can become recognizable across social media, fashion, entertainment, advertising, and mainstream sports media. Caitlin Clark is one example. Angel Reese is another. Aya Wilson is another. Sabrina Ionescu is another. And that means the league has more potential stars than ever before. That's important because the future of the WNBA cannot depend entirely on one player. Caitlin Clark can be the entry point. But the league needs to give new fans more reasons to stay. Maybe they discover Angel Reese. Maybe they become fans of Aya Wilson. Maybe they follow Sabrina Ionescu. Maybe they find another team they love. That's how a casual viewer becomes a dedicated fan. And that's how a league grows. This is why the current generation of players has an opportunity that previous generations did not have at the same scale. They can build their own audiences. They can communicate directly with fans. They can create their own brands. And they can help introduce new people to women's basketball. The WNBA should recognize that opportunity. But recognition also comes with responsibility. The league has to maintain competitive integrity. It has to apply its rules consistently. It has to make sure players are protected when dangerous plays occur. And it has to avoid creating the impression that some players receive one standard while others receive another. That perception can be damaging, even when the reality is more complicated. Sports depend heavily on trust. Fans need to believe that the competition is legitimate. They need to believe that the rules are applied fairly. And they need to believe that players are being treated consistently. That's why controversial moments become so important. One incident can create a much bigger conversation about the entire league. And when the player involved is Caitlin Clark, that conversation becomes even louder. Millions of people are watching. Millions of people have opinions. And millions of people are ready to share those opinions. That creates pressure. But it also creates attention. And attention is something every professional sports league wants. The challenge is turning attention into long-term credibility. That's where the WNBA's next chapter becomes so important. The league has an opportunity to build something much bigger than a temporary ratings surge. It can build a generation of fans. It can build new rivalries. It can create new stars. It can attract more investment. It can create more opportunities for players. And it can make women's basketball a permanent part of the mainstream American sports conversation. Caitlin Clark can help accelerate that process. But she cannot do it alone. The players have a role. The teams have a role. The coaches have a role. The league office has a role. And most importantly, the fans have a role. Because fans decide what stories continue. They decide which games matter. They decide which players become stars. And they decide whether the attention surrounding women's basketball becomes a lasting movement. That's why the debate around Clark is so intense. People aren't simply arguing about a basketball player. They're arguing about what the future of women's basketball should look like. Some fans want the league to embrace Clark as its biggest star. Others want the league to spread its attention more evenly across every team and player. But perhaps the smartest approach is to do both. Celebrate the biggest stars while continuing to build the entire league. That's how the NBA grew. That's how other major sports leagues grew. You don't have to choose between one superstar and everyone else. You can use superstar to be promoted. The rivalries have to develop naturally. And the league has to give fans reasons to care beyond social media arguments. That is the long-term challenge. Because viral moments disappear. A sustainable fan base does not. One controversial clip can generate millions of views. But a strong league can generate millions of fans for decades. That's the difference between a moment and a movement. And the WNBA is now trying to turn this moment into a movement. Caitlin Clark is at the center of that transformation. Angel Reese is part of it. Aya Wilson is part of it. Sabrina Ionescu is part of it. And countless other players are helping shape what comes next. That's why the current era is so important. We don't yet know exactly how it will be remembered. Maybe the Fever become champions. Maybe Caitlin Clark becomes an MVP. Maybe another team dominates the next several seasons. Maybe a new superstar eventually becomes the face of the league. Nobody knows. And that's what makes sports so compelling. The future hasn't been written yet. But one thing is already clear. Caitlin Clark has changed the conversation. She has changed the level of attention. She has changed expectations. And she has forced people who previously ignored women's basketball to pay attention. Now the question is what she does with that opportunity. Can she become an even more complete player? Can she lead Indiana deep into the playoffs? Can she eventually win a championship? Can she become one of the greatest players in WNBA history? Those questions will take years to answer. But the journey is already underway. And Stephanie White now has a major role in that journey. She has to prove that the Fever made the right decision. She has to develop Clark. She has to develop the roster. She has to create a winning culture. And she has to turn all of this attention into actual basketball success. That's the standard now. Because once you're coaching Caitlin Clark, being competitive isn't enough. The expectations are higher. The spotlight is brighter. And every decision is going to be watched. That's not necessarily fair. But it's the reality of professional sports. The biggest stars attract the biggest scrutiny. And Clark has already entered that world. So when you look back at the controversial moments, the physical plays, the debates about officiating, the coaching decisions, and the arguments surrounding the Fever, remember one thing. This is only the beginning. Caitlin Clark's story is still being written. The Indiana Fever are still building. The WNBA is still evolving. And the next few seasons could determine whether this becomes one of the most important eras in women's basketball history. The questions are still there. Was Stephanie White the right coach? Can the Fever build a championship roster around Clark? Can the WNBA turn this enormous attention into long-term growth? And can Caitlin Clark eventually become the champion and generational superstar that so many fans believe she can be? We don't have those answers yet. But we will. And that's exactly why people are watching. Because the next chapter is going to be decided where it always should be decided. On the basketball court. But this is where the story becomes much bigger than one player, one coach, or one controversial moment. Because when you look at everything that happened around Caitlin Clark, the Indiana Fever, Sophie Cunningham, and Stephanie White, you begin to see a much larger conversation about the direction of the WNBA itself. The league spent decades trying to reach the level of mainstream attention it is receiving today. For most of its history, women's professional basketball had to fight for television coverage, sponsorship money, larger audiences, and national recognition. Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and the conversation changed dramatically. Whether someone loves Caitlin Clark or is tired of hearing her name, one thing is difficult to deny. She brought an enormous amount of attention to the league. WNBA television viewership increased dramatically. Arena attendance records were being challenged in multiple cities. More fans were following teams that they had never watched before. And sponsors suddenly had another reason to invest in women's basketball. That kind of growth creates opportunities for everyone. And according to Sophie Cunningham, that is exactly what people inside the league should understand. The question should not be, why is Caitlin Clark getting so much attention? The better question should be, how can everyone benefit from the attention Caitlin Clark is creating? That distinction is extremely important. Because if Clark brings new fans into the WNBA, those fans can eventually discover other players. They can discover Angel Reese. They can discover Aya Wilson. They can discover Sabrina Ionescu. They can discover Sophie Cunningham. They can discover teams they never knew existed. And eventually, those casual viewers can become lifelong WNBA fans. That is how leagues grow. But when people become focused on who deserves the credit, the bigger opportunity can get lost. And this is precisely why Cunningham's comments created such a strong reaction. She wasn't simply saying that Caitlin Clark was talented. She was talking about economics. She was talking about business. She was talking about the reality that increased attention creates increased opportunities for everyone. And from that perspective, her argument is simple. If the league is making more money because more people are watching, then why should anyone be angry that Caitlin Clark is receiving attention? Why not use that attention to build the entire league? That is the question Cunningham appeared to be asking. And it is also the question many fans have been asking for years. Now let's return to the numbers mentioned in the original story. The WNBA announced a new media rights agreement that was described as being worth approximately $2 billion over 11 years. That is an enormous change compared with the economics of the league's earlier years. And this is why the Caitlin Clark discussion cannot simply be dismissed as fan drama. There is a business component to all of this. More viewers create more value. More value creates more media interest. More media interest creates stronger sponsorship opportunities. Stronger sponsorship opportunities can create better resources for teams and players. And that can ultimately help the entire league. But here's the uncomfortable part. When one player becomes significantly more popular than the others, some people are naturally going to feel that the attention is uneven. That happens in almost every major sport. Michael Jordan became bigger than many of the teams he played against. LeBron James became a global brand. Stephen Curry became a global brand. And their popularity sometimes overshadowed the other players around them. But the NBA did not try to make those stars less popular. It used their popularity to promote the entire league. That may be the lesson the WNBA now has to learn. Caitlin Clark doesn't have to be the only star. She can simply be one of the biggest entry points into the sport. And if the league handles that correctly, everybody can benefit. But that brings us back to the original controversy. Because while the business side of the story is positive, the physical side has been much more complicated. Clark's rookie season was extremely demanding. She was playing against professional athletes who were stronger, faster, and more experienced. She was also dealing with an enormous amount of attention. Every game was televised. Every mistake was analyzed. Every foul became a debate. Every physical play became a viral clip. And that pressure can take a toll on any athlete. Then, during her second season, the injuries became the dominant story. Clark only appeared in 13 games during the regular season. That was a devastating development for Indiana. The player who had helped transform the franchise's popularity was suddenly spending much of the season on the bench. And fans immediately began searching for explanations. Some pointed toward the physical nature of her rookie season. Others mentioned her off-season workload. Others discussed the demands of playing professional basketball. And some people even tried to suggest that there was a psychological explanation. That is where Sophie Cunningham strongly disagreed. When Skip Bayless suggested that some of Clark's injuries could have been connected to mental pressure caused by jealousy, mental frustration is difficult. The emotional frustration is difficult. And according to Cunningham, Clark was working hard to return and improve. That defense of her teammate became another reason fans paid attention to Cunningham's comments. Because it wasn't coming from someone sitting at home watching television. Cunningham was inside the locker room. She was Clark's teammate. She was experiencing the professional environment firsthand. And that gave her words more weight in the eyes of many fans. But we still need to separate observation from fact. Cunningham can describe what she personally experienced. Fans can have their opinions. Analysts can debate the situation. But none of that automatically proves that jealousy caused Clark's injuries. There is a difference between a player's personal opinion and independently established evidence. That distinction matters. And it matters even more when discussing something as serious as player safety. The same principle applies to the controversy surrounding Stephanie White. Fans can look at the timeline and feel uncomfortable. They can remember the playoff series. They can remember Carrington. They can remember Clark's eye injury. They can remember that no foul was called. And then they can see Stephanie White become Clark's coach only weeks later. Those facts are part of the timeline. But the conclusion that White personally wanted Clark hurt would require evidence that has not been established by those events alone. That is why the story is so emotionally powerful but also so complicated. The facts and the perceptions are constantly being mixed together. And social media has made that problem even bigger. A short clip can remove context. A headline can exaggerate a quote. A fan account can repeat an allegation as if it were confirmed. Then another account copies it. Before long, thousands of people believe they are discussing a proven fact. That is why viewers need to be careful. The controversy is interesting enough without turning speculation into certainty. And there is another reason this matters. The WNBA is still building its long-term reputation. The league needs fans to believe in the product. It needs players to trust the competition. It needs sponsors to trust the league. And it needs television partners to believe that audiences will continue watching. If fans begin believing that the league protects certain players or ignores certain behavior, that trust can be damaged. But if the league applies its rules consistently and communicates clearly, it can strengthen that trust. That is the real challenge. Not Caitlin Clark versus the rest of the WNBA. Not Sophie Cunningham versus Stephanie White. Not Angel Reese versus Caitlin Clark. The bigger challenge is whether the league can manage an unprecedented period of growth without allowing the drama to overwhelm the basketball. Because there is an enormous opportunity here. Women's basketball has more attention than it has had in decades. There are more recognizable players. There are stronger rivalries. There are more fans. There is more media coverage. There is more money. And there is a generation of young athletes watching all of it happen. That is something the league should protect. And perhaps this is the biggest lesson from the entire Stephanie White controversy. A coaching decision can be analyzed from a basketball perspective. A player can be analyzed from a performance perspective. A controversial incident can be analyzed from a rules perspective. But the fans are going to interpret everything through emotion. That's normal. Fans care about their players. They care about their teams. And they remember moments that made them angry. For Indiana Fever fans, the 2024 playoff series became one of those memories. When they saw Caitlin Clark on the floor holding her eye, that image stayed with them. When they saw Stephanie White on the opposite sideline, that association became even stronger. So when the Fever hired White, some fans didn't see an experienced championship-level coach. They saw the coach from the other side of that playoff series. That's the difference between an objective resume and a fan's emotional memory. Both can exist at the same time. White can have an impressive resume. And fans can still feel uncomfortable about the hire. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. But ultimately, basketball results are going to determine which interpretation survives. If Indiana wins, develops, and competes for championships, the controversy will gradually become part of the past. If the team struggles, the same questions will continue coming back. That's the reality of professional sports. Winning changes everything. And for the Indiana Fever, winning has become the next objective. Because Caitlin Clark has already changed the level of attention around the franchise. Now the organization needs to turn that attention into sustained success. And that's where the next chapter begins. The story is no longer simply about whether Caitlin Clark is the face of the WNBA. The question is what the league does with the opportunity that her popularity has created. Can the WNBA turn casual viewers into permanent fans? Can it build multiple new stars? Can it create rivalries that last for years? Can it maintain competitive integrity while the spotlight becomes brighter? Can Indiana build a championship team around Clark? And can Stephanie White prove that the controversial hiring decision was actually the right basketball decision? Those answers cannot be found on a podcast. They cannot be found in a comment section. They cannot be found in a viral video. They will be answered on the court. And that is why the next stage of this story may be even more important than everything that came before it. And now we arrive at the question that matters most. What happens next? Because the Caitlin Clark story is no longer simply about one rookie entering the WNBA. It has become a story about an entire league changing in real time. The Indiana Fever are at the center of that change. Caitlin Clark is at the center of the Fever. And Stephanie White is now responsible for helping determine what comes next. That is an enormous responsibility. But it is also an enormous opportunity. White has the experience. Clark has the talent. The Fever have the audience. Now they need the results. That's the part that cannot be manufactured. You can create a marketing campaign. You can promote a superstar. You can sell tickets. You can generate social media engagement. But you cannot fake winning. Eventually, the basketball has to speak for itself. And that is exactly what makes the upcoming chapter so fascinating. If Clark returns healthy and continues developing, Indiana could become a completely different team. Imagine Clark with another year of professional experience. Imagine her understanding WNBA defenses better. Imagine her becoming more comfortable against physical defenders. Imagine her teammates becoming more familiar with her passing angles. Imagine White designing an offense specifically around everything Clark does best. That combination could be extremely dangerous. And that's why expectations are so high. People aren't expecting Clark to simply repeat what she did before. They're expecting her to improve. They're expecting the Fever to improve. And they're expecting the organization to take the next step. That means reaching the playoffs isn't necessarily going to be enough forever. Eventually, fans will want Indiana to compete for championships. That's what happens when a franchise gets a player with this much potential. Standard changes. The goals become bigger. The pressure becomes greater. And the spotlight becomes brighter. But Clark isn't the only player who could benefit from this growth. The entire Fever roster has an opportunity. Every player around her can become more recognizable. Every teammate can benefit from the attention. Every home game can become a major event. And every road game can become an opportunity for another arena to experience the Caitlin Clark effect. That's a powerful business model. But again, it only works if the basketball remains compelling. Fans may come once because of Clark. They will keep coming if the team is exciting. That's the difference between curiosity and loyalty. WNBA now has millions of curious viewers. The challenge is turning them into loyal fans. And that requires more than one superstar. It requires stories. It requires rivalries. It requires competitive teams. It requires players with different personalities and different styles. And the league has many of those ingredients already. Angel Reese represents one style. Aya Wilson represents another. Sabrina Ionescu represents another. Caitlin Clark represents another. That diversity is a strength. Women's basketball does not need every player to look the same or play the same way. The differences are part of what makes the league interesting. And the rivalry between Clark and Reese is a perfect example. Their careers began with comparisons. Their college rivalry created huge attention. Their professional careers have continued to generate debate. But ultimately, their success can coexist. There doesn't have to be only one winner. The sport can have multiple superstars. In fact, it needs multiple superstars. That's how major sports become bigger. One star brings attention. Another star keeps it growing. Then another generation comes along. That's how an ecosystem develops. And the WNBA is now in the middle of that process. The biggest mistake would be turning every player into an enemy of Caitlin Clark. That creates unnecessary division. The better story is that Clark is helping create more attention for everyone. When people tune in to watch Clark, they may see Reese. When they watch Reese, they may discover Wilson. When they watch Wilson, they may discover another team. And slowly, the entire league becomes more important. That is the opportunity. But there is another issue that cannot be ignored. The league has to be careful about how it handles controversy. Because the more popular the WNBA becomes, the more scrutiny it will receive. Every decision will be examined. Every referee call will be replayed. Every disciplinary decision will become a headline. Every player comment can become a viral story. That's not going away. The internet has changed sports permanently. And the WNBA is now experiencing that reality at an entirely different level. That means communication is going to become increasingly important. When something controversial happens, fans want answers. They want explanations. They want transparency. They don't want vague statements. They don't want silence. And they certainly don't want to feel as though different standards are being applied to different players. The league has an opportunity to build trust by being clear. And trust is extremely important because this growth is still relatively new. Many of the people watching today are first-time WNBA viewers. They are learning the teams. They are learning the rules. They are learning the players. They are forming their opinions right now. The experience they have during this period could determine whether they remain fans. That's why every game matters. Every decision matters. Every interaction matters. The league isn't just competing for today's audience. It is competing for the audience of the next decade. And Caitlin Clark's generation could become the bridge between the WNBA's past and its future. That's why this moment is so important. But let's come back to the Indiana Fever. Because ultimately, this is where the entire debate becomes real. The Fever made the decision to hire Stephanie White. Now they have to stand behind that decision. They have to give her the resources to succeed. They have to give her a roster capable of competing. And they have to allow her to build the system she believes will maximize the team. At the same time, White has to prove that she deserves the opportunity. She has to establish trust with her players. She has to create a culture. She has to communicate clearly. And she has to show that the Fever can become a serious contender. For Caitlin Clark, the next step is equally important. She has to continue developing. She has to stay healthy. She has to become more comfortable with the physicality of the league. She has to continue improving defensively. And she has to find ways to become even more efficient offensively. Because opponents are going to adjust. They have already studied her. They know her tendencies. They know what she likes to do. They know how dangerous she is in transition. They know how dangerous she is from deep. And they know that allowing her to get comfortable can completely change a game. So Clark has to keep evolving. That's what great players do. They don't stay the same. They adapt. They improve. They add new skills. They find new ways to win. And that's why the next few years are going to be so interesting. We don't know how good Clark will ultimately become. We don't know how many championships she could potentially win. We don't know whether she will become an MVP. We don't know whether she will eventually become the greatest player in WNBA history. Those are impossible questions to answer right now. But we can say this. She has already changed the conversation. She has already created enormous attention. She has already helped bring new fans into women's basketball. And she has already become one of the most recognizable young athletes in American sports. That is not speculation. That's the reality of the moment. Now the question is whether the basketball success can catch up with the popularity. That's where the real test begins. Because popularity creates expectations. And expectations create pressure. The Fever have to handle that pressure. White has to handle that pressure. Clark has to handle that pressure. And the league has to handle that pressure. If they do, the result could be something extraordinary. A successful Indiana Fever team built around Caitlin Clark could become one of the biggest stories in women's sports. It could create new rivalries. It could create new stars. It could bring even more fans into the WNBA. And it could establish a new standard for what a women's professional basketball franchise can become. But if the organization gets the important decisions wrong, the same spotlight that created the opportunity can become a source of criticism. That's the difficult part of being at the center of attention. The same audience that celebrates you when you win will question you when you lose. The same fans who praise you after a great performance will criticize you after a bad one. That's professional sports. And Caitlin Clark is already learning that lesson. It can focus entirely on one superstar. Or it can use that superstar to introduce fans to an entire generation of players. The choice is ultimately up to the league. But the opportunity is right in front of them. And Caitlin Clark is one of the biggest reasons that opportunity exists. So now we wait. We wait to see what Stephanie White does. We wait to see how the Fever roster develops. We wait to see how Clark returns. We wait to see whether Indiana can take the next step. And we wait to see how the rest of the WNBA responds. Because the league has never had this exact moment before. There is no perfect blueprint. Nobody can know exactly what will happen. But that's what makes this era so exciting. We are watching it happen in real time. And years from now, people may look back at this period and recognize it as one of the defining moments in the history of women's basketball. The arguments will eventually fade. The controversial clips will eventually become old news. Coaching decisions will eventually be judged by their results. But the growth of the sport could last much longer. That's the real story. Not the outrage. Not the social media arguments. Not the endless debates. The real story is that women's basketball has an opportunity to become bigger than it has ever been. And Caitlin Clark is one of the athletes helping push it toward that future. Now it's up to the league, the teams, the coaches, the players, and the fans to decide what happens next. Because the spotlight is already here. The audience is already watching. And the next chapter is about to begin. But here is the awkward issue. If Caitlin Clark really is responsible for bringing this much attention and new revenue into the league, then the question becomes very simple. Why would anyone inside the WNBA want to minimize that impact? The answer isn't necessarily that everyone does. In fact, many people throughout the league clearly understand how valuable Clark's popularity has become. But there is a difference between recognizing someone's business value and agreeing that one player should receive all the attention. That is where the debate becomes complicated. The WNBA is filled with talented athletes. There are established veterans. There are former champions. There are all-stars. There are players who have spent years building the league before Caitlin Clark ever arrived. Those players deserve recognition too. But recognizing those players doesn't require pretending that Clark's impact doesn't exist. And that is essentially the argument Sophie Cunningham was making. Her position was that the league should benefit from Clark's popularity rather than fight over who deserves credit for the growth. If television audiences are increasing, that's good. If sponsorship money is increasing, that's good. If arenas are selling more tickets, that's good. If players are receiving better travel opportunities, that's good. And if all of those developments are happening while Caitlin Clark is bringing new viewers into the sport, then the entire league should benefit. That is the business argument. And it is difficult to ignore. But now let's look at the other side. Caitlin Clark is still one player. The WNBA cannot become dependent on one athlete forever. That would create its own problems. What happens when Clark retires? What happens if she changes teams? What happens if another superstar eventually becomes more popular? A healthy league has to develop more than one attraction. That's why players such as Angel Reese, Aya Wilson, Sabrina Ionescu, and many others remain important to the future of women's basketball. Caitlin Clark can be a major part of the growth without being the entire growth strategy. And that's where the league has an opportunity to be smart. Use the attention. Don't waste it. Turn casual viewers into basketball fans. Give those viewers more players to follow. Give them more teams to care about. Give them more reasons to watch games even when Caitlin Clark isn't playing. That's how a league becomes sustainable. But while that business conversation continues, the controversy surrounding Clark's treatment remains. Millions of people watch her games. Every action she makes is analyzed from multiple angles. Every achievement becomes a headline. And every mistake can become a major story. That is what happens when an athlete becomes one of the biggest names in basketball. But at the same time, veterans throughout the league are still competing at the highest level. They bring years of experience. They bring physicality. They bring pride. They bring competitive intensity. And none of that should disappear simply because a new superstar has arrived. The challenge for the WNBA is finding the balance. Fans want physical basketball. They want rivalries. They want competitive games. They want intensity. But they also want consistency. They want fairness. They want respect. And most importantly, they want to know that the rules are being applied consistently. That's where officiating becomes such an important part of the conversation. If a player makes legal contact, that's basketball. If a player commits a hard but legitimate foul, that's part of competition. But if a play crosses the line into unnecessary or dangerous contact, fans expect officials to respond. And they expect the same standard to apply regardless of who is involved. That's the real issue. It isn't about creating special treatment for Caitlin Clark. It is about maintaining the same standard for every player. Because if the league loses that consistency, fans begin questioning the competition itself. And once fans start questioning the integrity of the game, the problem becomes much bigger than one foul. That is why these incidents receive so much attention. The WNBA is no longer operating outside the mainstream sports conversation. Every major moment can reach millions of people within minutes. A clip from one game can appear on social media before the players have even left the arena. A controversial call can become a national debate overnight. And a player's comments can create headlines across the entire sports world. Caitlin Clark's popularity makes that effect even stronger. When she plays, people watch. When she struggles, people talk. When she gets fouled, people debate. When she succeeds, people celebrate. That level of attention is both a blessing and a burden. It creates enormous opportunities. But it also creates enormous pressure. And Clark has continued dealing with that pressure by focusing on basketball. Rather than allowing every controversy to define her career, she has continued to compete. She has continued to develop. She has continued to show why so many people believe she can become one of the defining players of her generation. That resilience is one of the biggest reasons her supporters continue to stand behind her. Because being the face of a league isn't easy. It means every game matters more. Every mistake receives more attention. Every injury becomes a major story. And every opponent becomes more motivated to prove something against you. That's the reality of being a superstar. And veterans understand that pressure. This is where the conversation surrounding Larry Bird becomes particularly interesting. Bird knows what it means to play under enormous pressure. During his career, he faced some of the toughest competitors and defenders basketball has ever produced. He understands physical basketball. He understands rivalry. He understands what it means to be targeted because you're one of the best players on the court. But the larger point isn't simply about being tough. It's about protecting the integrity of the game. Basketball should ultimately be decided by basketball ability, skill, strategy, execution, teamwork, not unnecessary controversy. That's why discussions about Caitlin Clark's treatment continue to attract so much attention. Fans are asking legitimate questions. Should officials be stricter? Should dangerous plays receive stronger penalties? Should the league do more to protect its biggest stars? Or is everything we're seeing simply part of professional basketball? There isn't one universal answer. Different fans will see the same play differently. Different players will have different opinions. Different analysts will interpret the same moment in different ways. But that's exactly why transparency standard would have been applied to another player. Those questions aren't unreasonable. They are part of maintaining trust. And trust is going to become increasingly important as the WNBA continues to grow. Because the league is no longer fighting simply to get attention. It has attention. Now it has to keep it. The arenas are getting louder. The television audience is growing. Social media conversations are expanding. New fans are discovering women's basketball. And younger athletes are watching these stars and imagining themselves playing professionally one day. That is an enormous opportunity. But it also means every controversy has a larger impact. What happens to Caitlin Clark doesn't just affect Caitlin Clark. It can affect how millions of new viewers perceive the WNBA. What happens to Angel Reese can affect the same audience. What happens to Aya Wilson can affect the same audience. What happens to any major player can become part of the league's larger story. That's why the WNBA needs to think beyond individual moments. The league has to think about the next decade. It needs to build credibility. It needs to develop stars. It needs to maintain competitive integrity. And it needs to make sure that the massive new audience doesn't disappear once the initial excitement fades. That is the real challenge. And Caitlin Clark is at the center of it. Not because she controls the league. She doesn't. Not because every success belongs to her. It doesn't. But because she has become one of the biggest catalysts for the attention surrounding women's basketball. That reality cannot simply be ignored. And it shouldn't be. Instead, the league should use it. Turn the attention into growth. Turn growth into investment. Turn investment into better opportunities. And turn those opportunities into a stronger future for every player. That's the bigger picture. Now, as we move forward, the most important question isn't whether Caitlin Clark is popular. We already know she is. The question is what happens next. Can the Indiana Fever build a championship team around her? Can Stephanie White prove that she was the right choice? Can Clark stay healthy and continue developing? Can Angel Reese and the other young stars build their own legacies? And can the WNBA turn this period of unprecedented attention into something permanent? Those questions will take time to answer. But that's what makes the story so compelling. We're watching an important period in women's basketball unfold in real time. And every season will add another chapter. Every rivalry will add another chapter. Every playoff series will add another chapter. And every major decision made by the league will shape how this era is remembered. For Caitlin Clark, the mission remains simple. Play basketball. Keep improving. Stay focused. And let the results speak. She cannot control every headline. She cannot control every opinion. She cannot control every foul. She cannot control what people say on social media. But she can control how she prepares. She can control how she competes. And she can continue proving herself on the court. That's what great athletes do. And that's why the next chapter of this story could be even bigger than everything we've seen so far. The WNBA is growing. The audience is watching. The pressure is increasing. And Caitlin Clark remains at the center of one of the biggest transformations women's basketball has ever experienced. So now the question goes to you. Do you think the WNBA is doing enough to protect its biggest stars while still allowing the physical, competitive style of basketball that fans love? Do you believe Sophie Cunningham's comments reflect something real inside the league? Was Stephanie White the right choice for Indiana? And what do you think the future holds for Caitlin Clark, the Indiana Fever, and the WNBA? Let me know what you think in the comments. Keep the conversation respectful, because different basketball fans can see the same situation very differently. And if you enjoyed this breakdown and want more in-depth basketball analysis, WNBA stories, Caitlin Clark updates, and major NBA and women's basketball discussions, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this story is not over. The next chapter could be even bigger. And we'll be here to break it all down. The next chapter of this story is not going to be decided by social media. It is not going to be decided by viral clips. And it is not going to be decided by the loudest opinion on the internet. It is going to be decided by what happens on the basketball court. That is especially true for Caitlin Clark. Because the conversation around her has already reached a level that very few young athletes experience. Every game is watched. Every possession is analyzed. Every great pass becomes a highlight. Every deep three becomes a headline. And every difficult moment becomes another debate. That is the reality of becoming one of the biggest names in basketball. But Clark has something even more important than popularity. She has time. Her professional career is still developing. She has years ahead of her to improve. She has opportunities to learn from mistakes. And she has the chance to build a legacy that will eventually be measured by much more than attention. That is why the next stage of her career is so important. The rookie excitement has already introduced millions of people to her. Now the challenge is turning that attention into sustained basketball success. And that responsibility does not belong to Clark alone. It belongs to the entire Indiana Fever organization. The front office has to continue improving the roster. The coaching staff has to continue developing the team's system. The players have to understand their individual roles. And everyone has to understand one fundamental reality. The Fever are no longer operating under the radar. They are one of the most watched teams in women's basketball. That means opponents are going to prepare differently. Every team wants to beat the team featuring Caitlin Clark. Every arena wants the attention that comes with her arrival. Every television network understands that her games can attract viewers. And every major basketball conversation can suddenly include the Fever. That creates pressure. But it also creates an advantage. The Fever can use that attention to attract players. They can use it to strengthen their brand. They can use it to create a stronger connection with fans. And they can use it to build something much bigger than one season. That's the opportunity sitting in front of Indiana. But the organization has to make smart decisions. A superstar cannot fix every weakness. If the defense is poor, Clark cannot solve that alone. If the rebounding is inconsistent, Clark cannot solve that alone. If the bench is struggling, Clark cannot solve that alone. If the team lacks experience, Clark cannot magically create it. That's why roster construction matters so much. The best teams aren't simply collections of talented individuals. They are teams where the pieces fit together. And that is what Stephanie White now has to figure out. What combination of players gives Clark the best chance to succeed? What defensive system gives Indiana stability? What offensive system creates the most opportunities? What lineup gives the team the best balance? Those questions sound simple. They aren't. Coaching at the professional level requires constant adjustment. One opponent may defend Clark differently from another. One team may switch everything. Another may trap her. Another may attempt to pressure her full court. Another may try to force the ball out of her hands. The Fever have to be prepared for all of it. And Clark has to continue learning how to respond. That is what makes great players special. They eventually begin anticipating what the defense is going to do before it happens. They see the trap coming. They recognize the mismatch. They know where the open teammate will be. And they make the correct decision before the defense can recover. Clark already has many of those abilities. Now she has to keep refining them. And that is where the coaching relationship becomes so important. A great coach doesn't simply tell a superstar what to do. A great coach creates an environment where the superstar can make the biggest possible impact. That is the challenge facing White. And it is also the opportunity. If White can help Clark reach another level, the entire Fever organization benefits. The team's results improve. The players around Clark improve. The fan base becomes even more invested. And the national conversation becomes even larger. But there is another part of this story that deserves attention. The WNBA itself has to make sure the growth surrounding Clark doesn't create unnecessary division. Basketball is naturally competitive. Fans are naturally passionate. Rivalries are healthy. Arguments about players are normal. But the sport becomes stronger when the rivalry stays focused on basketball. Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese can be exciting. Indiana versus another championship contender can be exciting. A superstar matchup can create enormous interest. But the league should ultimately be able to celebrate all of those players. Because the success of one does not require the failure of another. That's an important message for the next generation of fans. You can support Caitlin Clark without attacking Angel Reese. You can support Angel Reese without attacking Caitlin Clark. You can admire Aya Wilson while still supporting another team. You can appreciate Sabrina Ionescu without choosing sides in every debate. That's how sports should work. Different players can inspire different fans. And that diversity makes the league stronger. The WNBA has an opportunity to create a generation of fans who follow women's basketball for many different reasons. Some will come because of Clark's shooting. Some will come because of Reese's physical style. Some will come because of Wilson's dominance. Some will come because of Ionescu's versatility. Others will discover completely different players. That's exactly what the league needs. And the more people who become invested in the sport, the more sustainable its future becomes. But sustainability requires credibility. That means the league must continue taking competitive integrity seriously. Officials need to enforce the rules. Players need to respect those rules. Teams need to accept accountability. And when something controversial happens, the league needs to communicate clearly. Because the larger the audience becomes, the less room there is for confusion. A small controversy can become a major national story in minutes. A controversial foul can generate millions of views. A player's comment can dominate sports media. And a coaching decision can become a debate that lasts for weeks. That's modern professional sport. The WNBA cannot avoid that reality. It has to learn how to manage it. And Caitlin Clark is one of the biggest reasons the challenge has become so important. She has brought a massive audience into the conversation. Now the league has to give that audience a reason to stay. That means better storytelling, better promotion, better access to players, more competitive games, and most importantly, a product that fans genuinely enjoy watching. The opportunity is enormous. But so is the responsibility. Because the people watching today could become the fans who support the league 20 years from now. The children watching Clark today could eventually become the next generation of WNBA players. That's how sports legacies are created. One generation inspires another. And that may ultimately become Caitlin Clark's greatest contribution. Not just the records. Not just the highlights. Not just the television ratings. But the possibility that millions of young athletes see a professional basketball player who looks like someone they can aspire to become. That's powerful. And it's something the league should embrace. But Clark's story still has a long way to go. She has to stay healthy. She has to keep developing. She has to deal with criticism. She has to deal with pressure. She has to deal with expectations. And she has to continue competing against players who are determined to stop her. That is professional basketball. Nobody is going to make it easy. Every season becomes harder. Every opponent learns more. Every weakness gets exposed. And every strength gets challenged. That's why the next stage of Clark's career will tell us much more than her first stage did. Can she adapt? Can she become more complete? Can she lead? Can she perform when the pressure is highest? Can she eventually lead Indiana to a championship? Those are the questions fans will be watching. And if she succeeds, the impact could extend far beyond Indiana. A championship run could become a defining moment for women's basketball. A Caitlin Clark title could attract even more attention. It could create another wave of new fans. It could increase interest in other WNBA teams. And it could strengthen the league's position in the broader American sports market. But even if the championship doesn't come immediately, the process itself matters. The Fever have time to build. Clark has time to develop. White has time to establish her system. And the league has time to turn this period of rapid growth into something permanent. That's why the next few seasons could be so important. They will tell us whether this was simply a temporary explosion of interest or the beginning of a much larger transformation. And there are reasons to believe the latter is possible. The talent is there. The audience is there. The business interest is there. The rivalries are there. And the stories are everywhere. Now the league has to bring all of those pieces together. For Indiana, that starts with one simple objective. Build the best possible environment for Caitlin Clark and the rest of the team. Not a team built around headlines. Not a team built around social media. A real basketball team. A team that can defend. A team that can execute. A team that can handle pressure. A team that can compete in the postseason. That's the standard. And that's why the decision to bring in Stephanie White will eventually be judged by results. If Indiana becomes a contender, the criticism will fade. If the team develops and wins, the controversy becomes part of history. But if the team struggles, people will revisit every question. Was the coaching system right? Was the roster good enough? Did the front office make the right decisions? Did the organization do enough to support Clark? Those questions are unavoidable. But they don't need to be answered today. The court will eventually answer. The next major rivalry changes everything. That's why sports remain unpredictable. And that's why fans keep watching. The story never stays still. Every game changes something. Every season changes something. Every player develops. Every team adjusts. And every generation leaves its mark. Caitlin Clark is now part of that history. The question is how big her chapter will eventually become. And perhaps the biggest question of all is whether the WNBA can turn this moment into a lasting legacy. Because the opportunity is bigger than one player. It's bigger than one franchise. It's bigger than one season. This is an opportunity for women's basketball as a whole. The league has the attention. Now it needs to earn the loyalty. It needs to show new fans why they should continue watching. It needs to give them competitive games. It needs to give them stars. It needs to give them rivalries. And it needs to give them moments they will remember. Caitlin Clark has already provided many of those moments. Now the rest of the league has to build on them. That's the challenge. That's the opportunity. And that's why this story is far from finished. The next chapter is already being written. And this time, the headlines won't be enough. The basketball has to deliver, and now we reach the part of the story that could ultimately determine how this entire era of women's basketball is remembered. Because Caitlin Clark has already done something that very few athletes accomplish so early in their professional careers. She has changed the conversation. But changing the conversation is only the beginning. The next challenge is changing the results. For the Indiana Fever, that means turning attention into competitive success. It means building a roster capable of handling the toughest teams in the league. It means creating a system that allows Caitlin Clark to use every part of her game. And it means developing a culture where winning becomes the expectation rather than the surprise. That's a completely different challenge. Popularity can bring people through the doors. But championships create legacies. And that is where Clark's story is heading now. She isn't simply trying to prove that she belongs in the WNBA anymore. That question has already been answered. Now she's trying to determine how far she can go. Can she become an elite two-way player? Can she consistently control games against experienced defenses? Can she become the kind of player who makes everyone around her better? And eventually, can she lead the Fever to the top? Those questions are going to follow her for the rest of her career. And every season will provide another piece of the answer. The pressure will increase. The competition will become tougher. And the expectations will continue rising. But there is another important factor. Caitlin Clark isn't the only young player trying to build a legacy. Angel Reese is doing the same thing. Other young stars are doing the same thing. The WNBA is entering a new generation where several players could become household names. That's exciting for the league. It means fans don't have to choose only one player. They can follow multiple stars. They can enjoy different styles. They can support different teams. And they can watch rivalries develop naturally over time. That's how professional sports become cultural institutions. The greatest rivalries aren't manufactured overnight. They develop through competition. They develop through playoff battles. They develop through memorable performances. And they develop because fans care about the outcome. That's what makes the Clark-Reese storyline so interesting. Their rivalry began long before the WNBA. But their professional careers are where the story could become truly historic. They could compete for awards. They could compete for championships. They could compete for all-star selections. And they could spend years pushing each other to improve. If that happens, the WNBA could benefit enormously. Because every major sports league needs stories that fans want to follow for years. And this generation has several potential stories. But the league has to protect those stories by keeping the competition credible. That's why officiating and player safety remains so important. The more popular the league becomes, the more important consistency becomes. Fans don't expect every call to be perfect. No professional sports league can guarantee that. But they do expect the same rules to apply to everyone. That's a reasonable expectation. And when something controversial happens, people want the league to explain what happened. Transparency can prevent speculation from becoming reality. Silence can sometimes have the opposite effect. When fans don't have information, they create their own explanations. And social media can spread those explanations extremely quickly. That's one of the biggest challenges facing modern sports. A rumor can travel faster than a correction. A dramatic headline can receive more attention than a detailed explanation. And once millions of people see something, correcting the record becomes much harder. That's why viewers should always separate confirmed information from speculation. This is especially important when stories involve serious accusations against players, coaches, officials, or league executives. A claim isn't automatically a fact simply because it appears online. And a viral video isn't automatically proof of someone's intentions. Those distinctions matter. They matter for the players. They matter for the league. And they matter for the fans. Because the goal should be to discuss basketball honestly. Not to create unnecessary accusations. Not to turn every disagreement into a scandal. And not to allow social media outrage to replace evidence. The WNBA has enough genuine stories without needing manufactured ones. Basketball itself is already compelling. The talent is real. The rivalries are real. The growth is real. And the opportunity is real. That's why the league should focus on those things. And that's also why Caitlin Clark's future remains so fascinating. She has already helped bring enormous attention to the sport. But now she has the opportunity to build something much more important. A legacy. A championship legacy. A leadership legacy. And potentially a legacy that inspires the next generation of players. That takes time. It takes consistency. It takes resilience. And it takes the ability to deal with setbacks. Clark has already experienced setbacks. Injuries. Difficult losses. Criticism. Pressure. And constant media attention. But setbacks are part of every great athlete's journey. The question is what happens afterward. Does the player become discouraged? Or does the player return stronger? That's what fans will be watching. And that's where coaching becomes so important. Stephanie White now has to help create the environment where that growth can happen. She needs to know when to push Clark. She needs to know when to give her rest. She needs to know how to use her strengths. And she needs to make sure the team doesn't become predictable. Because once opponents understand an offense, they begin finding ways to stop it. That's why adjustments matter. Great coaches adjust. Great players adjust. Great teams adjust. And the Fever will have to do all three. If they can, the results could be significant. Imagine Indiana entering the playoffs as a legitimate championship threat. Imagine Clark leading a high-pressure playoff game. Imagine the Fever facing one of the league's established powers. Imagine the atmosphere. That's the kind of moment that could define a generation. And it would also show how far women's basketball has come. A few years ago, many casual sports fans couldn't name several WNBA players. Now, those same fans are discussing playoff matchups, coaching decisions, player rivalries, and championship possibilities. That is growth. And the league needs to protect it. Because attention is difficult to earn. Once you have it, you cannot take it for granted. Fans have options. There are countless sports competing for their time. The NFL. The NBA. College sports, basketball has to make them stay. That's the ultimate test. And perhaps that is why the next phase of the Indiana Fever is so important. The team has already captured attention. Now it needs to capture respect. Not because fans are required to respect them. Because the team has to earn it. By competing. By improving. By defending. By winning. And eventually, by challenging for championships. That's what will determine whether this era becomes a temporary phenomenon or a lasting transformation. If Clark continues improving and Indiana continues building, the Fever could become one of the defining franchises of the new WNBA era. And if other teams build around their own young stars, the entire league could become more competitive. That would be the ideal outcome. Not one dominant team. Not one superstar carrying everything. But an entire league filled with compelling teams and recognizable players. That's the future the WNBA should want. And that's the future fans should want too. Because competition makes everything better. More competitive games create more excitement. More excitement creates more viewers. More viewers create more value. More value creates more opportunities. And more opportunities create a stronger league. It's a cycle. And Caitlin Clark is already helping accelerate that cycle. But now the responsibility extends beyond her. The Fever have to do their part. The league has to do its part. The players have to do their part. And fans have to do their part. The next chapter isn't going to be written by one person. It's going to be written by everyone involved. And that's what makes this moment so important. We're watching the WNBA evolve. We're watching new stars emerge. We're watching old rivalries change. We're watching new audiences discover the sport. And we're watching Caitlin Clark move from being a highly anticipated prospect into one of the most important players in the league. The pressure is enormous. But so is the opportunity. And perhaps that's the best way to understand everything that has happened. The controversy is part of the story. The coaching debate is part of the story. The rivalry discussions are part of the story. The business growth is part of the story. But none of those things are the final story. The final story will be what happens over the next several years. Will Clark win championships? Will Indiana become a powerhouse? Will the WNBA continue growing? Will new stars emerge? Will the league become a permanent part of mainstream American sports culture? Those answers are still unknown. And that's exactly why we keep watching. Because the future hasn't been written. Every game gives us another clue. Every season gives us another chapter. Every playoff series gives us another memory. And every major decision changes the direction of the story. For Caitlin Clark, the mission remains clear. Continue improving. Continue competing. Continue leading. And continue letting basketball speak louder than the noise surrounding it. Because eventually, the debates will fade. The headlines will change. The social media arguments will move on to another topic. But what remains is the career. The performances. The championships. The records. And the legacy. That's what Clark is ultimately playing for. And that's what the Indiana Fever are ultimately building toward. So the biggest question isn't what happened yesterday. It's what happens next. Will Caitlin Clark take another step forward? Will Stephanie White prove that she was the right coach? Will Indiana finally become a championship contender? And will the WNBA turn this incredible period of attention into a permanent new era? Nobody knows the answers yet. But the next season will bring us closer. And one thing is certain. The basketball world will be watching. Because Caitlin Clark isn't simply part of the WNBA's future anymore. She is already one of the biggest reasons people are paying attention to it today. The story now reaches a point where the future matters more than the controversy of the past. Caitlin Clark has already changed the level of attention surrounding women's basketball, but attention alone does not create a lasting legacy. Performance does. Consistency does. Winning does. And that is exactly where the Indiana Fever now find themselves. They have one of the most recognizable young stars in professional basketball. They have a growing fan base. They have an organization receiving more attention than ever. And they have a coach in Stephanie White who now has the responsibility of turning all of that potential into a competitive team. That is not an easy assignment. But it may be one of the most important assignments in the WNBA right now. Because if Indiana succeeds, the impact could extend far beyond the Fever. A successful Clark-led Fever team could create another generation of fans. It could increase interest in the league. It could create new rivalries. It could make more players household names. And it could prove that the enormous attention surrounding Clark can translate into sustained basketball success. But there is another side to that equation. The Fever cannot build their entire future around headlines. They need basketball fundamentals. They need defense. They need rebounding. They need depth. They need consistency. And they need players who can perform when Clark is being heavily defended. That is what separates a popular team from a championship team. A popular team attracts attention. A championship team survives pressure. And Indiana is going to experience plenty of pressure. Every opponent will want to prove something against them. Every game involving Clark can become a major event. Every loss will receive additional attention. Every victory will create new expectations. And every playoff game will be analyzed from beginning to end. That is the reality of having a superstar. But Clark has already shown that she is comfortable playing under pressure. Her career has been built around expectations. At Iowa, she was expected to lead. When she entered the WNBA, she was expected to transform Indiana. And now, she is expected to help the Fever become a serious contender. The expectations have never disappeared. They have simply become bigger. And that is why development is so important. Clark doesn't have to become perfect overnight. She has to become better every season. Better decision-making. Better defense. Better efficiency. Better leadership. Better understanding of professional defenses. Better understanding of when to attack and when to create opportunities for teammates. Those small improvements can eventually create a massive difference. And this is where White's coaching becomes so important. A good coach can help a talented player improve. A great coach can help a talented player understand exactly how to use that talent at the highest level. White now has the opportunity to do that with Clark. But she also has to develop the players around her. Because the Fever's success cannot depend on Clark scoring every night. There will be games when her shot isn't falling. There will be games when defenses trap her. There will be games when opponents force her into difficult decisions. And there will be games when another Fever player has to become the difference maker. That's what championship teams do. They don't depend on one solution. They have multiple solutions. If Clark is covered, someone else steps up. If the outside shot isn't working, they attack the paint. If the offense struggles, the defense keeps them in the game. If the starters struggle, the bench provides energy. That's the type of balance Indiana needs. And if they find it, the Fever could become much more dangerous. But let's take another step back. The bigger story isn't only Indiana. It's the WNBA. The league is entering a period that could eventually be remembered as a turning point. There is more attention. There are more recognizable players. There is more media coverage. There is more investment. And there is a new generation of fans discovering the sport. That's an opportunity that cannot be wasted. The league needs to make sure those new fans understand that Caitlin Clark is part of a much larger basketball world. There are dozens of players worth watching. There are teams with their own histories. There are rivalries that deserve attention. There are veterans who helped build the league. And there are young players who could become future superstars. That is the real opportunity. Clark can open the door. The rest of the league has to invite fans inside. And if the WNBA can accomplish that, the impact could be enormous. A viewer who initially watches because of Clark could eventually become a fan of the entire league. They might start watching another team's game. They might buy another player's jersey. They might follow another rivalry. They might watch the playoffs even when Clark isn't involved. That's how casual attention becomes permanent fandom. And that's what every professional sports league wants. But to accomplish that, the league needs credibility. It needs fair competition. It needs consistent officiating. It needs clear communication. And it needs to make sure that controversy doesn't become more important than basketball. That's a difficult balance. Because controversy generates clicks. But credibility creates long-term value. A viral argument may attract viewers for one day. A trusted league can keep viewers for decades. That's the difference. And as the WNBA becomes more popular, the difference will become increasingly important. The league cannot control every conversation. It cannot control every fan. It cannot control every social media post. But it can control how it responds. It can provide information. It can explain decisions. It can enforce rules consistently. And it can focus attention back on the sport. That's what responsible growth looks like. And that's why the controversies surrounding Caitlin Clark are worth examining carefully. Some moments are genuine basketball debates. Some are questions about officiating. Some are simply fan disagreements. And some claims circulating online may not have enough evidence to be treated as facts. That distinction matters. Especially when stories involve serious allegations. A responsible basketball discussion should separate what is confirmed from what is speculation. That doesn't make the story less interesting. It actually makes the story more credible. And credibility is exactly what the WNBA needs as its audience expands. The league has an opportunity to attract millions of new viewers. But those viewers need to trust what they are watching. They need to believe the competition is real. They need to believe players are being treated fairly. And they need to believe that the sport is bigger than social media drama. Because at the end of the day, the reason people fall in love with sports isn't controversy. It's competition. It's the final seconds of a close game. It's a player hitting a huge shot. It's a comeback. It's a defensive stop. It's a playoff series. It's a championship. Those are the moments people remember. And Caitlin Clark has already created plenty of memorable moments. Now she has the opportunity to create even bigger ones. The question is whether those moments will eventually include a championship. That's the ultimate goal. For Clark. For the Fever. For White. And for the fans. A championship would change the conversation. It would turn potential into achievement. It would turn expectations into reality. And it would give Indiana something that every franchise ultimately wants. A legacy. But even before that happens, the process matters. The development matters. The growth matters. The improvement matters. And the journey matters. That's what makes the next chapter so exciting. Nobody knows exactly where it ends. Maybe Clark becomes an MVP. Maybe she wins multiple championships. Maybe Indiana becomes one of the dominant teams of the next decade. Maybe another young superstar challenges her for the spotlight. Maybe the WNBA continues growing until it becomes an even larger part of American sports culture. All of those possibilities remain open. And that's why fans keep watching. Because the future hasn't been decided. The next game can change the conversation. The next season can change expectations. The next playoff series can create a new rivalry. And the next championship can create a new legend. For Caitlin Clark, this is only the beginning. The pressure is enormous. But so is the opportunity. She has already shown that she can handle attention. Now she has to show that she can handle expectations. Those are two different things. Attention comes when people are curious. Expectations come when people believe you can achieve something. And millions of people now expect Clark to achieve something significant. That is the burden of becoming a superstar. But it can also become the motivation. Because every great athlete eventually reaches a point where being talented isn't enough. They need to prove it. They need to perform when the pressure is highest. They need to win when everyone expects them to win. And they need to respond when people doubt them. That is the stage Clark is entering now. And that's why the Indiana Fever's future is so important. This isn't simply about a team improving. It's about whether one of the biggest young stars in basketball can turn extraordinary potential into an extraordinary career. Stephanie White will have a role. The Fever front office will have a role. Clark's teammates will have a role. And Clark herself will have the biggest role of all. The pieces are already moving. The league is already changing. The audience is already watching. Now the basketball has to deliver. So when we look at everything that has happened, perhaps the most important conclusion is this. The story isn't finished. The controversy isn't the ending. The coaching debate isn't the ending. The social media arguments aren't the ending. The real ending will come years from now. When we can look back at Caitlin Clark's career and understand what she actually accomplished. When we can look back at the Indiana Fever and see whether they became a championship organization. And when we can look back at the WNBA and see whether this period of explosive growth became the foundation of an entirely new era. That's the story worth following. And for now, developing its players. It needs to continue improving the fan experience. It needs to continue promoting its stars. And it needs to continue building trust. Because the audience watching today is paying attention. They are deciding whether they want to become long-term fans. And that decision will be influenced by everything they see. The basketball. The atmosphere. The players. The competition. The stories. And the way the league responds when things become difficult. That's why this era matters. It isn't simply about one player. It is about the direction of an entire sport. And Caitlin Clark happens to be one of the most visible faces of that change. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with more questions than answers. Can Indiana become a championship team? Can Clark eventually become an MVP? Can the Fever build a roster strong enough to support her? Can Stephanie White create a winning culture? Can Angel Reese and other young stars develop equally powerful legacies? Can the WNBA convert today's attention into tomorrow's loyalty? And perhaps the biggest question of all. How will we remember this era when we look back 10 years from now? Will we say this was the moment women's basketball finally entered a new level? Will we say Caitlin Clark was the player who helped change everything? Or will we look back and realize that the real transformation came from an entire generation of players working together? Maybe the answer will be both. Because history is rarely created by one person alone. One player can open the door. But an entire generation has to walk through it. And right now, that door is wide open. The audience is watching. The players are competing. The franchises are building. The league is growing. And the next chapter is already beginning. For Caitlin Clark, the mission is simple. Keep improving. Keep competing. Keep leading. And keep letting the basketball speak. Because when the noise eventually disappears, the only thing that will remain is the legacy she built. And that legacy has only just begun. Biggest question now is not whether Caitlin Clark has changed the WNBA. The evidence of her impact is already impossible to ignore. Bigger question is what the league does with that opportunity. Because attention can disappear just as quickly as it arrives. The WNBA has to turn today's excitement into tomorrow's foundation. And that requires more than one superstar. It requires an entire ecosystem. It requires teams that can compete. It requires players who can become household names. It requires strong coaching. It requires smart management. And it requires fans who believe that what they're watching is worth following for years. That is where the next stage becomes so important. Caitlin Clark has already brought millions of eyes toward women's basketball. Now those eyes need reasons to stay. That means the league has to continue telling the stories of its players. Fans need to understand who these athletes are. They need to know their personalities. They need to understand their rivalries. They need to see their journeys. And they need opportunities to become emotionally invested in teams. Because that's how professional sports build lifelong fans. A person may discover the WNBA because of Caitlin Clark. But they could eventually become a fan of Indiana. Another viewer might discover Angel Reese and become interested in Chicago. Someone else might discover Aya Wilson and start following Las Vegas. Another person might become fascinated by Sabrina Ionescu and follow New York. That's how the league expands. One player brings someone in. Then the entire sport gives that person more reasons to stay. And that is why the growth surrounding Clark should not be viewed as a threat to the rest of the league. It should be viewed as an opportunity. If more people are watching Indiana, the league can introduce those viewers to other teams. If more people are searching for Clark, they can discover other stars. If more people are watching WNBA highlights, they can discover the history of the league. The possibilities are enormous. But there is one condition. The product has to be strong. The games have to be competitive. The players have to be protected by consistent rules. And the league has to maintain credibility. Because fans may tolerate mistakes. What they don't tolerate for long is a feeling that they cannot trust what they're watching. That's why transparency matters. When controversial situations happen, explanations matter. When officiating becomes a major topic, communication matters. When decisions affect players and teams, accountability matters. The bigger the league becomes, the more important those things become. And Caitlin Clark's presence has accelerated that process. Everything involving her receives more attention. That's both a blessing and a challenge. For Indiana, it means every decision will be analyzed. For the WNBA, it means every major controversy can become a national discussion. For Clark herself, it means there is almost nowhere to hide. But perhaps that's also what makes her journey so interesting. She is learning what every superstar eventually has to learn. You cannot control the noise. You can only control your response to it. There will always be criticism. There will always be comparisons. There will always be people who believe another player deserves more attention. There will always be debates about statistics. There will always be debates about awards. There will always be arguments about officiating. And there will always be people waiting for the next controversial moment. Clark doesn't need to answer every one of those people. Her answer can come through her basketball. That's ultimately the strongest response an athlete can give. Work harder. Improve. Compete. Win. And keep moving forward. That's the mentality that can eventually turn a popular player into a legendary player. But popularity itself isn't meaningless. It has already helped change the economics surrounding women's basketball. More attention can create more commercial opportunities. More viewers can increase the value of broadcast. More interest can help teams sell tickets. More recognizable players can attract sponsors. And greater visibility can create more opportunities for future athletes. That impact matters. But the challenge is making sure that growth reaches the entire ecosystem. It can't stop at the biggest stars. It has to reach the rest of the players. It has to reach more teams. It has to reach younger athletes. And it has to create opportunities that didn't previously exist. That's when you know a sports movement has become something permanent. The stars are important. But the system around the stars is even more important. And this is where the WNBA has a chance to build something special. The league doesn't need to choose between honoring its veterans and promoting its young stars. It can do both. It can celebrate the players who built the league. And it can promote the players who are carrying it into the future. Those two stories can exist together. In fact, they should. Because Caitlin Clark wouldn't be entering the same professional environment without the players who came before her. The veterans created the foundation. The new generation is expanding it. That's how sports history works. One generation builds. The next generation expands. And eventually, another generation takes it even further. Clark is now part of that process. And the same is true for Reese and the other young stars entering the league. They aren't replacing the history of women's basketball. They're adding another chapter. That's an important distinction. And it is one that fans should remember when debates become heated. A new star doesn't erase an old star. A new rivalry doesn't erase previous rivalries. A new generation doesn't erase the generation that came before it. It all becomes part of the same history. And that's why the current moment is so fascinating. We're watching several different eras overlap. We're watching established veterans compete against young stars. We're watching traditional basketball styles meet new approaches. We're watching social media transform the way fans interact with athletes. And we're watching the WNBA become more visible within mainstream American sports culture. That's a massive change. But change always creates tension. Some people welcome it. Some people resist it. Some people believe the league is moving too quickly. Others believe it isn't moving quickly enough. Both opinions will exist. That's normal. The important thing is what the league does next. Because growth without direction can become chaos. Growth with a clear strategy can become a revolution. And that's the crossroads the WNBA is approaching. The league has attention. It has talent. It has stories. It has passionate fans. Now it needs execution. And execution starts with the basics. Build strong teams. Develop players. Promote rivalries responsibly. Improve the fan experience. Maintain competitive integrity. And give viewers reasons to return. That's the formula. It's not complicated. But doing it consistently is difficult. For Indiana, that process begins with Clark. The Fever need to make sure that her talent is surrounded by the right pieces. They need to create an offense that maximizes her passing. They need to give her opportunities to use her shooting range. They need to reduce the pressure on her by developing other reliable scoring options. And defensively, they need to become a team that can survive against the best opponents. Because eventually, talent alone won't be enough. The playoffs expose weaknesses. Every possession becomes more valuable. Every mistake becomes more expensive. And every opponent has more time to prepare. That's where champions separate themselves. They don't simply survive the regular season. They perform when everything becomes more difficult. Clark will eventually face that test. And when she does, the entire basketball world will be watching. That could become one of the defining moments of her career. Not because of a viral clip. Not because of a social media argument. But because of the pressure. A playoff game. A close score. Seconds remaining. A ball in Clark's hands. That's the kind of moment that creates legends. And if she succeeds in moments like that, the conversation changes forever. People stop asking whether she belongs. They start asking where she ranks. They stop asking whether the attention is justified. They start discussing her legacy. That's the ultimate transition. From potential to achievement. From prospect to superstar. From superstar to legend. But we are not there yet. There is still work to do. There are still seasons to play. There are still opponents to beat. There are still lessons to learn. And there are still challenges that nobody can predict. That's why it is too early to write the ending. The story is still developing. And perhaps that's the most exciting part. We don't know exactly what happens next. Maybe Clark takes another massive leap. Maybe the Fever become a championship contender. Maybe another young star becomes the face of the league. Maybe an unexpected team dominates. Maybe a rivalry becomes the defining storyline of the next decade. Sports have a way of surprising everyone. That's why predictions are never guarantees. The only certainty is that the next chapter will be watched closely. And Caitlin Clark will remain one of the central figures in that conversation. So when you look at the entire story, don't focus only on the controversy. Don't focus only on the headlines. Look at the bigger transformation. Women's basketball is reaching a new audience. Young players are becoming household names. Veterans are receiving greater recognition. Teams are attracting more attention. And fans who may never have watched the WNBA before are now talking about it every day. That is the real story. And Caitlin Clark is one of the biggest catalysts behind it. Now the challenge is to make sure that catalyst creates something lasting. Something bigger than one player. Something bigger than one franchise. Something that survives long after today's headlines disappear. Because that's what a true legacy looks like. It doesn't end when the player leaves the court. It continues through the people inspired by that player. It continues through the fans who discovered the sport. It continues through the young athletes who decided they wanted to play basketball. And it continues through the league that became stronger because that player was part of it. That's the possibility in front of Caitlin Clark. And that's why the next few years matter so much. The WNBA has reached a crossroads. The attention is here. The stars are here. The fans are here. Now the question is whether the league can build something powerful enough to keep them. And if it succeeds, we may look back at this period as the moment everything changed. Not because one player did everything, but because one generation helped push the entire sport forward. And Caitlin Clark will always be one of the most recognizable names associated with that transformation. The story isn't over. The biggest chapters may still be ahead. The next game is coming. The next season is coming. The next rivalry is coming. And eventually, the next championship will come. When it does, we'll find out which players were truly ready for the moment. Until then, the only thing we can do is watch. Watch the games. Watch the development. Watch the rivalries. Watch the league grow. And watch Caitlin Clark continue writing her story one game at a time. Because the final chapter hasn't been written yet. And that is exactly why the story remains so compelling.